Is that a joke, sir, or are you actually claiming you had a rank once? The young Marine's voice carried farther than he expected, sharp and confident, the kind of confidence that only came from a crisp new uniform and a few years of service under a bright desert sun. Conversations inside the large olive-drab GP tent slowed, then tilted toward the sound like heads turning toward a sudden clap of thunder. Corporal Ethan Brooks stood with his arms folded across his chest, a faint grin pulling at the corner of his mouth as he looked down at the old man seated quietly on a metal folding chair near the display table. Around them hung the steady rustle of canvas in the warm Carolina breeze and the low murmur of families moving between exhibits that told the story of the Corps, rifles from distant wars, faded photographs, and flags stitched with names. But in that moment none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was the old man. Walter Hayes didn't look like someone who belonged in the center of a Marine Corps open house. His khaki pants were pressed but worn thin at the knees, his pale blue polo shirt faded from years of sun, and the brim of his old ball cap rested loosely in his weathered hands. He sat with the quiet patience of someone used to waiting, his shoulders slightly rounded with age but his back still carrying the memory of a straighter posture. Brooks shifted his weight, his polished boots scraping lightly across the gravel floor beneath the tent. "Sir," he continued, louder now, glancing briefly at the other Marines nearby who had started to notice the exchange, "this area is for active duty personnel and invited guests. So I'm going to need to know exactly what your rank was, if you had one." A couple of younger Marines near the equipment table exchanged amused looks. One of them let out a short laugh before quickly trying to hide it behind his hand. The old man didn't react. Not immediately. Walter Hayes simply looked up slowly, the motion calm and deliberate, like a man lifting his eyes from a long thought rather than from an insult. His gaze moved across the inside of the tent, the rows of folding chairs, the families drifting past, the young Marines standing tall in their uniforms, before finally settling on Brooks. There was no anger in his expression, no embarrassment, just a quiet steadiness that seemed strangely out of place in the middle of the corporal's bravado. Brooks tilted his head, mistaking the silence for confusion. "Well," he said with a smirk, "don't worry. This isn't a test. I'm just curious what kind of rank someone like you might have had back in the day." The canvas walls shifted again as a gust of wind rolled across the parade grounds outside, sending a ripple through the hanging flags above the exhibits. Somewhere beyond the tent a loudspeaker crackled with announcements about the afternoon demonstration. Inside, however, the air had changed. People nearby had begun to slow their steps. A few visitors paused beside the historical display of Marine uniforms, their attention quietly drifting toward the exchange unfolding in the center aisle. Walter Hayes noticed none of it, or perhaps he noticed everything. His eyes rested on the young corporal for a long moment before he lowered them again, brushing a thumb across the edge of the worn cap in his hands. It was the kind of small, absent movement that belonged to someone remembering something far away. Brooks exhaled through his nose, growing impatient. "Look," he said, gesturing casually around the tent. "There are thousands of Marines who come through events like this every year. But usually they remember what their rank was." The faint grin returned to his face as he leaned forward slightly. "So go ahead, sir," he added. "What was it?" Walter Hayes lifted his head once more, his pale eyes clear beneath the soft lights strung along the tent frame. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and calm enough to make the air inside the canvas shelter feel suddenly very still. Walter Hayes held the young Marine's gaze for a moment longer. Then the faintest hint of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, not mocking and not proud, simply patient, like a man who had watched storms come and go for a very long time. Corporal Ethan Brooks waited, expecting either a stammering explanation or the embarrassed shrug of someone caught where he did not belong. Instead, the old man answered in the same calm tone one might use when giving the time of day. "Private First Class," Walter said quietly. The answer seemed so ordinary that Brooks blinked once in confusion. A couple of the nearby Marines chuckled again, louder this time, relieved by what they assumed was the harmless truth of the situation. Brooks straightened and spread his hands as if presenting proof. "Private First Class," he repeated with a grin. "So you did not even make corporal?" The laughter around the equipment table grew a little bolder now. One of the younger Marines leaned against a crate of display gear and shook his head. That explains it, he said under his breath. Walter Hayes did not react to the laughter. He simply rested his cap against his knee and folded his hands together over it. There was something about the way he sat that did not match the picture Brooks had already decided on. The old man did not look embarrassed. He did not look defensive. If anything, he looked as though the noise inside the tent had drifted somewhere far away from him. Brooks tilted his head again, trying to recover the momentum of the moment. Well, he said, drawing the word out as if savoring it, that clears things up. A private first class at a Marine Corps open house. That is a long drive for nostalgia, sir. A few visitors nearby exchanged uncertain glances. The tone of the exchange had started to feel uncomfortable. A young mother holding her son by the hand slowed her steps beside a table displaying old field radios, her attention lingering on the quiet old man rather than on the corporal, who was clearly enjoying himself. Brooks noticed the growing audience and leaned into it. Let me guess, he continued, gesturing lightly toward Walter's faded shirt. Vietnam era, maybe. Did a couple of years, got out, and decided to come back and see the old gear again. Walter Hayes lifted his eyes once more. The pale blue color of them seemed almost translucent in the filtered sunlight slipping through the canvas roof. Something like that, he said. The answer was so soft that Brooks had to lean closer to hear it. The corporal studied the old man's face, searching for some sign that he had finally pushed far enough to get a reaction. But there was nothing there except that same quiet stillness. Brooks shifted his weight again, glancing briefly at the small group of Marines who had gathered behind him. You know, he said, his voice carrying again across the tent, most people who come through here like to talk about their service. Stories, units, deployments. You are the first Marine I have ever met who seems allergic to details. Walter Hayes brushed a thumb across the brim of his old cap again, the movement slow and absent, like someone tracing the edge of a memory. For a moment, he looked past Brooks entirely, his attention drifting toward the far side of the tent where a display banner showed a photograph of Marines standing in a cold wind beneath a line of distant mountains. When his eyes returned to the young corporal, they carried the same calm patience as before. Some things are easier to remember quietly, he said. The words were simple, but they landed in the air with a weight that made the laughter behind Brooks fade into silence for a second or two. Brooks cleared his throat, brushing away the strange pause. Right, he said briskly. Quiet memories. That must be it. He stepped half a pace closer to Walter and pointed casually toward the old man's collar. Then maybe you can explain something for me, sir. His finger hovered over a small, dull piece of metal pinned crookedly near the seam of Walter's shirt. It was not polished like a modern insignia and not shaped like any badge Brooks recognized. It looked more like a rough fragment of metal someone might have picked up off the ground years ago and decided to keep. Brooks tapped it lightly with his finger. Because I have been in the Marine Corps long enough to recognize most pins, he said, his voice returning to that teasing edge. But I have never seen anything like this one. Corporal Ethan Brooks flicked the small piece of metal once more with the tip of his finger, the dull tap barely audible above the low hum of conversation inside the tent. Up close the object looked even stranger. It was no polished insignia, no carefully stamped badge issued by the Marine Corps. It was rough, uneven along the edges, the surface worn smooth in places as if it had spent decades being touched by the same careful hand. A few people in the nearby crowd leaned forward slightly, curiosity slowly replacing the earlier laughter. Brooks tilted his head as he studied it. So what exactly is this supposed to be, he asked. It does not look like any Marine Corps pin I have ever seen. Walter Hayes looked down at the small piece of metal resting against the faded blue fabric of his shirt. For a brief moment his fingers rose toward it, but he stopped just short of touching it, as if even the lightest contact might wake something old and heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm. It is nothing official, he said. Brooks gave a quick laugh. That much I figured out already. One of the Marines behind him added quietly. Looks like something from a hardware store. The old man did not argue. His eyes stayed on the small object for a moment longer before drifting past it, somewhere deeper into memory. Brooks leaned closer, squinting at the metal fragment. It was no larger than a quarter, its edges slightly bent, the color somewhere between dull silver and darkened steel. There were no numbers, no letters, No emblem of an eagle, globe, or anchor. Just a simple irregular shape that could have come from almost anywhere. You know, Brooks said with a faint smirk, if someone is going to wear a pin around Marines, it usually helps if it means something. The comment drew another round of quiet chuckles from the younger Marines nearby. But the sound faded quickly when Walter Hayes finally raised his eyes again. There was no irritation in his expression, only a distant stillness, like a man standing on the shore of a place that existed a long time ago. It means something, he said softly. Brooks folded his arms again, waiting for the explanation that never seemed to arrive. Then go ahead, he said. Explain it. Walter Hayes did not answer right away. The canvas walls of the tent shifted again as another warm breeze rolled across the open field outside. A row of small flags above the exhibits rustled gently, their fabric whispering against the metal poles. Somewhere outside, a group of children laughed as they ran past the parked display vehicles. Inside the tent, however, the air felt oddly still. Walter's eyes settled briefly on the small piece of metal once more. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet weight of someone remembering a promise that had never been written down. It came from a radio antenna, he said. Brooks frowned slightly, clearly not expecting that answer. A radio antenna, he repeated. Walter nodded once. A broken one. The Marines behind Brooks exchanged puzzled looks. The explanation sounded almost ridiculous. A scrap of metal from an antenna pinned to an old man's shirt like it was a medal. Brooks shook his head slowly, amused again. So you kept a piece of junk from a broken radio for 50 years and decided to wear it to a Marine Corps event. Walter Hayes looked at him steadily. Someone gave it to me, he said. The simple statement landed quietly in the air. Brooks lifted his hands in mock surrender. Well, that clears everything up. A few more scattered laughs rose from behind him, though they sounded weaker now. Because even without understanding why, several people in the tent had begun to sense that the small piece of metal was not a joke to the man wearing it. Walter Hayes finally lifted his hand and gently touched the edge of the worn fragment. The movement was slow, almost reverent. And for the first time since the conversation had begun, something faint shifted behind his pale blue eyes, like a door opening onto a memory that had waited a very long time to be seen again. Walter Hayes kept his fingers resting lightly against the small piece of metal, his thumb tracing the smooth curve worn into it by decades of quiet habit. For a moment he did not speak. The canvas walls of the tent rustled again in the afternoon breeze, and the distant sound of a helicopter demonstration carried faintly across the base like a low rolling hum. But inside the tent the noise of the open house had begun to fade into a careful silence. Corporal Ethan Brooks watched the old man closely now, the easy grin he had worn earlier slowly thinning as the pause stretched longer than expected. Someone gave it to you, Brooks repeated, as if testing the words for flaws. That still does not explain why it belongs on your shirt. Walter lifted his eyes again, calm and steady. It was never meant to be worn, he said. Brooks frowned slightly. Then why keep it? Walter did not answer right away. His gaze drifted past the young Marine and settled again on the large banner hanging at the far side of the tent, the one showing a line of Marines standing shoulder to shoulder in cold mountain air. Beneath a gray sky. For a second the photograph seemed to hold his attention in a way that had nothing to do with the present moment. When he finally spoke again, his voice remained soft but carried farther across the quiet tent than anyone expected. Because the man who gave it to me said I should remember. Brooks shifted his stance, clearly unimpressed. Remember what? He asked. Walter's thumb pressed gently against the metal fragment again. The small object caught a thin beam of sunlight filtering through the canvas roof, and for a brief instant the dull surface reflected a pale glimmer across his hand. That I was there, Walter said. The words were simple, but something about the way he said them slowed the air around them. A few of the visitors who had gathered nearby exchanged uncertain looks. Brooks crossed his arms again, trying to reclaim the upper ground of the conversation. A lot of people were there, he said casually. Vietnam had plenty of Marines. Walter nodded once. Yes, he said quietly. It did. The corporal waited, expecting more explanation, but the old man seemed content to let the silence settle again. Brooks exhaled and shook his head, turning halfway toward the Marines behind him. See, he said with a faint laugh, this is what I mean. Every Marine has a story, but this one talks like a fortune cookie. The comment earned a few hesitant chuckles, though they sounded thinner now than before. Walter Hayes did not react to them. His eyes had drifted again to the metal fragment pinned near the collar of his shirt. Slowly, almost absent-mindedly, he brushed a finger across its edge. And in that quiet touch something shifted behind his pale blue eyes. The tent, the voices, the banners, the warm Carolina afternoon all seemed to slide a few inches away from him. Because the small piece of metal was not just a fragment of an antenna. It was a piece of a moment frozen in another time, when the air had smelled of rain and damp earth and the long wire of a field radio had snapped in the wind. The memory came back not as a story, but as a feeling. The weight of a young officer leaning against him, exhausted and shaking after hours of holding a position that had almost collapsed under pressure. The broken radio wire, lying across the mud like a lifeline cut loose. The officer's hand pulling a small section of the shattered antenna free and pressing it into Walter's palm with a tired grin that carried more gratitude than words could hold. Walter blinked once, and the present returned. The canvas tent was still there. The Marines were still watching. And Corporal Brooks was still waiting for an explanation that the old man had never really intended to give. Corporal Ethan Brooks waited for the old man to continue, but the explanation never came. The quiet inside the tent stretched longer than anyone expected, like a rope pulled tight between two people who were no longer speaking the same language. Brooks finally let out a small breath through his nose and shook his head again. "All right," he said, the edge of amusement returning to his voice as he glanced over his shoulder at the Marines standing nearby. "So we have a mysterious piece of metal from a broken radio antenna and a story that apparently stops halfway through." A few of the younger Marines shifted their weight, unsure whether to laugh again. Walter Hayes did not seem to notice the hesitation. His eyes had returned to the present, but something about his expression had changed. The calm was still there, but now it carried a deeper weight, the kind that settled into a room without asking permission. Brooks pointed lightly toward the pin again. "Let me guess," he continued, still trying to keep the moment light. "Some officer handed it to you after a long night in the field and told you it was special." Walter nodded once. "Something like that." The corporal tilted his head. "And that is why you kept it?" "Yes." Brooks raised his eyebrows. "For more than 50 years." Walter's gaze did not move. "Yes." The answer landed quietly but firmly, and for the first time Brooks felt a faint flicker of uncertainty he could not quite explain. The old man was not defensive. He was not embarrassed. If anything, he seemed completely comfortable with the silence that followed his answers, as though he had spent a lifetime speaking only when necessary. Brooks cleared his throat and gestured casually toward the display tables behind him. "You know, sir, Marines usually keep things that actually tell people something. Ribbons, unit patches, medals." His hand drifted toward the small fragment, again, hovering just inches from it. "But this," he said with a faint shrug, "this does not exactly say much." Walter Hayes looked down at the metal piece once more. The sunlight from the canvas roof shifted again, brushing across the worn surface and lighting the edge of the fragment in a pale glow. When he spoke this time his voice carried a quiet certainty that seemed to settle into the space around him. "It says enough." Brooks leaned back slightly. "Enough for what?" Walter did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted again toward the banner of Marines standing beneath the gray mountains, the image frozen in time like a photograph of patience itself. Then he looked back at the corporal. "Enough for the man who gave it to me," he said. The words hung in the air longer than expected. Brooks glanced briefly toward the Marines behind him, as if searching for support in their expressions, but the mood in the tent had shifted again. The laughter from earlier had faded into something quieter, something more watchful. One of the visitors standing near the equipment table leaned slightly toward another and whispered something under his breath. Brooks felt the attention and instinctively tried to reclaim control of the moment. "Well," he said with a light chuckle that sounded less confident than before, "I guess that makes it sentimental." Walter Hayes shook his head slowly. "No," he said. Brooks frowned again. "No." Walter's eyes remained steady. "It makes it a promise." The corporal stared at him for a second, clearly not expecting that answer. "A promise," he repeated. Walter nodded once more. "Yes." Brooks crossed his arms again, studying the old man carefully now. "And what kind of promise does a broken radio antenna represent?" Walter Hayes looked down at the small piece of metal for the final time, and when he lifted his eyes again his voice was calm enough to quiet the entire space around them. "The kind a man makes," he said, "when someone else trusted him to hold the line." The words settled into the air like a stone dropped into still water. For a few seconds nobody inside the tent said anything. Corporal Ethan Brooks remained standing in front of Walter Hayes, arms folded across his chest, but the posture that had once looked confident now felt strangely uncertain. "Hold the line," Brooks repeated slowly, as if the phrase itself needed inspection. A few Marines behind him shifted their weight, boots scraping softly across the gravel floor beneath the canvas. One of them glanced toward the banner on the far wall again, then back at the quiet old man in the folding chair. Brooks forced a small laugh, the sound sharper than he intended. "Sir, with all due respect, a lot of Marines have held the line at one time or another." Walter Hayes nodded gently, accepting the statement without argument. "Yes," he said. Brooks waited, expecting the old man to elaborate, to add some dramatic story or explanation that would justify the strange weight in his voice. But Walter simply sat there, hands resting on his cap, eyes calm and steady. The silence stretched again. Outside the tent, the distant sound of a passing truck rolled across the base road, followed by the faint call of a loudspeaker announcing the next demonstration. Inside the tent, however, the attention of the small crowd had narrowed completely onto the two men standing in the center aisle. Brooks shifted his stance again. "So," he said after a moment, trying to sound casual, "let me understand this correctly. You were a private first class. Someone gave you a piece of a broken radio antenna, and somehow that represents holding the line." Walter looked at him without irritation. "That is correct." Brooks spread his hand slightly. "That is quite a story for such a small piece of metal." Walter Hayes studied the young Marine for a moment, as if measuring the distance between the man standing in front of him and the one he had once been himself. When he spoke again his voice remained quiet, but it carried the calm certainty of someone who had no need to prove anything. "The story is not in the metal," he said. Brooks frowned. "Then where is it?" Walter lifted his gaze toward the rows of Marines standing behind the corporal, their uniforms bright under the filtered sunlight of the tent. "It is in the men who were there," he answered. The sentence settled gently across the room. Brooks looked briefly over his shoulder again, suddenly aware that the mood around him had shifted far beyond a simple joke. The younger Marines were no longer laughing. Some of them watched Walter Hayes with the cautious curiosity reserved for something they did not yet understand. Brooks cleared his throat. "All right," he said, his tone tightening slightly. "Then let us go back to the first question." He leaned forward a little, meeting Walter's eyes directly. "If you were only a private first class, why does any of this matter?" The old man did not hesitate this time. He lifted his cap slightly from his knee and brushed a thin line of dust from its brim before placing it back again. Then he looked up at the corporal with the same quiet composure he had shown from the beginning. "Because rank was never the point," Walter said. Brooks blinked once. "Then what was?" Walter Hayes held the young Marine's gaze for another steady moment, and when he answered his voice was calm enough to quiet even the distant rustle of the canvas above them. "Responsibility," he said. The word lingered in the warm air beneath the canvas roof, quiet but heavy enough that several people standing nearby shifted their posture without realizing why. Responsibility. Corporal Ethan Brooks held the old man's gaze for a moment longer, searching his face for some hint of exaggeration or humor, but Walter Hayes remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, calm, steady, and completely unbothered by the attention surrounding them. Brooks exhaled slowly through his nose and straightened his shoulders again. "Responsibility," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "You were telling me that a private first class was carrying that kind of responsibility." Walter Hayes nodded once, neither defensive nor proud. "Sometimes rank and responsibility travel together," he said quietly. "Sometimes they do not." The answer seemed simple, but it left the young Marine without the quick response he had been expecting. Brooks glanced briefly over his shoulder again, aware now that the small circle of observers had grown larger. A few families stood near the display tables, pretending to read the plaques while clearly listening. Two Marines from another unit had stepped closer to the edge of the aisle, their expressions curious rather than amused. Brooks cleared his throat and turned back toward Walter. "Well," he said carefully, "the Marine Corps usually likes things to be clear. Rank tells you who carries what responsibility. Walter Hayes tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the logic of the statement. Most of the time, he said. Brooks shifted his weight again, gravel crunching beneath his boot. The conversation had stopped feeling like a joke several minutes ago, though he could not say exactly when that change had happened. The old man had never raised his voice. He had never challenged the corporal directly. Yet something about his quiet certainty had slowly turned the entire exchange into something heavier than Brooks had planned. Behind the corporal, one of the Marines who had been laughing earlier now stood with his arms folded, studying Walter Hayes with a thoughtful expression. A second Marine leaned slightly toward him and whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear. Walter noticed none of it, or perhaps he noticed everything. His eyes rested calmly on Brooks as though the crowd surrounding them were simply background noise. "You asked about rank," Walter said after a moment. Brooks nodded once. "Yes, I did." Walter's fingers brushed the edge of the small metal fragment again, the motion slow and familiar. "And I answered you honestly." Brooks frowned slightly. "Private first class." Walter nodded. "That was the rank I wore." The corporal waited for him to continue, but again the old man allowed the silence to stretch. Brooks felt the strange pressure of the watching crowd and tried to steer the conversation back to firmer ground. "All right," he said, lifting his chin slightly. "But that still does not explain why you are sitting here at a Marine Corps event wearing a piece of metal that nobody recognizes and talking about responsibility like it outranks the chain of command." Walter Hayes looked at him steadily. For the first time there was the faintest hint of something deeper in his eyes. Not irritation, not pride, but the quiet patience of someone who had seen the same misunderstanding many times before. "Because the chain of command eventually learned the same thing," he said softly. Brooks blinked. "What thing?" Walter did not answer immediately. Instead his gaze drifted briefly past the young Marine and toward the entrance of the tent where the sunlight spilled across the gravel walkway outside. Standing near that entrance, half in shadow, was a tall Marine in the dark green service uniform of a senior non-commissioned officer. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Ruiz had been watching the exchange for several minutes now, his arms resting loosely at his sides, his expression thoughtful rather than amused. Ruiz had spent enough years in the Marine Corps to recognize something that younger Marines often missed. It was not the old man's words that had caught his attention. It was the way Walter Hayes carried himself. The stillness, the patience, the way he had never once tried to defend his reputation. Ruiz's eyes drifted toward the small piece of metal on Walter's collar, then back to the old man's face. A quiet sense of recognition stirred somewhere in the back of his mind, the feeling that he had heard a name like this before in places where Marines spoke more carefully. Slowly, without interrupting the conversation, Gunnery Sergeant Ruiz stepped away from the entrance and reached into his pocket for his phone. Near the entrance of the tent, Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Ruiz stepped a few paces to the side, keeping his voice low as he lifted the phone to his ear. The crowd inside the canvas shelter was still focused on the quiet exchange between Corporal Ethan Brooks and the old man seated in the folding chair, but Ruiz was no longer watching the argument. His eyes remained fixed on Walter Hayes as he waited for the call to connect. Years in the Marine Corps had taught him that some things could not be explained by rank alone. It was the posture that had caught his attention first. The old man did not sit like someone trying to defend himself. He sat like someone who had already lived through far worse conversations. Ruiz listened for a moment as the call connected on the other end. "Staff duty," a voice answered. Ruiz kept his tone professional and controlled. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Ruiz at the open house tent near the parade field. I need a quick confirmation on a name." There was a brief pause. "Go ahead." Ruiz glanced again toward Walter Hayes. The old man was still sitting calmly, while Corporal Brooks spoke to him with the stubborn persistence of someone trying to win an argument he no longer fully understood. "The name is Walter Hayes," Ruiz said quietly. The voice on the other end of the line did not answer immediately. Instead, there was the faint sound of a keyboard somewhere in the background. Ruiz watched the scene unfolding inside the tent while he waited. Brooks had stepped slightly closer to Walter again, clearly trying to re-establish control of the conversation. The younger Marines behind him remained silent now, their earlier amusement replaced with a cautious curiosity. "You said the chain of command eventually learned something," Brooks was saying. "What exactly did they learn?" Walter Hayes looked up at him with the same steady expression. That responsibility does not always wait for permission, he said. The sentence settled across the small crowd like a quiet echo. Brooks frowned again, opening his mouth to respond. But before he could speak, Ruiz heard the voice on the phone again. This time the tone had changed. Did you say Walter Hayes? Ruiz straightened slightly. Yes, that is correct. Another pause followed, longer than the first. When the voice returned, it sounded noticeably more alert. Can you confirm the spelling? Ruiz gave it calmly. There was another burst of typing on the other end. Inside the tent, Brooks had crossed his arms again, clearly determined not to let the conversation drift away from him. Look, he said, I respect what you are trying to say, sir, but this is still a Marine Corps event. There are procedures. Walter Hayes nodded. There usually are. Brooks gestured lightly toward the pin again. And that still does not explain why someone with your rank would carry that kind of reputation. Walter's expression did not change. Reputation is not something a man carries for himself, he said. It belongs to the people who remember. Brooks stared at him, clearly unsure how to respond. Behind him, the small crowd had grown completely quiet now. At the entrance of the tent, Gunnery Sergeant Ruiz felt the phone tighten slightly in his grip as the voice on the other end spoke again, this time slower. Gunny, are you standing near that man right now? Ruiz kept his eyes on Walter Hayes. Yes. The voice lowered even further. Do not escalate anything. Stay where you are. Ruiz frowned slightly. Why? The answer came after a short breath. Because someone very senior is going to want to know that he is there. The quiet warning from the phone call had barely settled in Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Ruiz's mind when the atmosphere inside the tent shifted again. It began with movement near the entrance, subtle at first, the way a ripple travels across still water before anyone fully understands its source. Several Marines standing near the opening suddenly straightened their posture without being told. A path opened naturally through the small crowd of visitors and service members, as though an invisible line of respect had been drawn across the gravel floor. Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed the change and turned slightly, irritation briefly flashing across his face as his attention broke away from Walter Hayes. But the irritation vanished almost instantly. A tall officer in a dark green service uniform had stepped beneath the canvas shade, the sunlight catching the silver stars on his shoulders before the fabric roof softened the glare. Major General Robert Cade moved with calm purpose through the aisle of onlookers, his expression focused, his stride steady and deliberate. The quiet murmur that had filled the tent earlier disappeared entirely. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the faint rustle of canvas seemed to pause as the general approached the center of the tent. Brooks instinctively stepped back, his posture snapping straight with the reflex drilled into every Marine since the first day of training. General on deck, someone whispered near the edge of the crowd, though no formal call was necessary. The authority of the moment was already clear. Major General Cade did not look at Corporal Brooks. He did not address the crowd. His attention moved directly to the elderly man seated calmly in the folding chair. Walter Hayes had not stood. He simply looked up as the general approached, the same quiet composure resting in his pale blue eyes. The two men regarded one another for a brief moment that felt longer than it was. Then something remarkable happened. Major General Robert Cade came to a precise stop 3 feet in front of Walter Hayes. His posture straightened even further, his shoulders squared, and with the smooth discipline of decades in uniform, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. The sound of fabric shifting against his sleeve seemed to echo through the entire tent. Every Marine present froze. Corporal Brooks stared in disbelief, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. A 4-star general standing at attention in front of the quiet old man he had been questioning only minutes earlier. Major General Cade held the salute for a respectful moment before lowering his hand. When he spoke, his voice carried the steady weight of absolute certainty. Private First Class Walter Hayes, the general said. It is an honor to finally meet you. The words struck the room with the force of revelation. Brooks blinked once, then again, his thoughts scrambling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him. Walter Hayes gave a small nod, almost embarrassed by the attention. Good afternoon, General, he replied quietly. Major General Cade allowed the faintest hint of a smile to cross his face. Sir, he said gently, the Marine Corps has been telling your story for years. Around them, the Marines who had been standing silently now exchanged stunned glances. Brooks felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. All the confidence he had carried earlier drained away in a single realization. The quiet old man he had treated like a curiosity was not just another veteran visiting an open house. Walter Hayes reached up and brushed his fingers lightly across the small piece of metal pinned to his collar. The worn fragment caught the light again as he spoke one final time, his voice calm and almost reflective. "It was never meant to be a story," he said softly. "Just a promise kept.